Chapter 31. Collision. Life is a series of collisions with the future. It is not the sum of what we have been, but what we yearn to be. Jose Ortega y Gasset. Jacob suddenly remembered being 5 and hiding from his mom. "Come and find me," he had called while huddled under the blankets. He had heard his mother's steps on the floor. She stood for a moment by the bed and then reached out and patted him. Her voice had a playful lilt as she said, "Ah, there you are, kiddo." "How do you always know where to find me?" Jacob had demanded. Jess had smiled and had hugged him and said, "I just do." Her smile faltered for a moment. Her eyes, far away, caught in a dark memory. "I'll always find you. I'll always come for you. You can depend on that." How many times through the years had she told him that? Not just when he was playing hide-and-seek, but when he had gotten separated from her at the town picnic a year later, or when he had wandered off in the woods when they had been hunting for morels. She had always found him, and when she did, she would wrap her arms around him, kiss the top of his head, and say the same thing. "I'll always find you, Jacob. How could I not?" His head was aching painfully. The man had hit him hard on the head, stunning him, and then dragged him inside of the dark house. Jacob felt tears coursing down his cheeks. He closed his eyes, repeating silently over and over, "Please come find me, Mom. Please." His father was a rapist, a murderer, someone his Uncle Chris obviously hated, and probably his mom, too. He had run away into the night, his eyes burning and his stomach heaving. He had run without direction, without purpose, everything he had understood about his life turned upside down, even as he heard his mom's voice in the distance calling his name. He ran fast, and before too long her calls faded into the distance. How could she have lied to him like that? Jacob felt as if something dark and unclean had occupied his body. He had asked a handful of times about his dad. Mom had always looked so sad, so haunted, that he had backed off and accepted the short, unsatisfactory answers she had given. "Your father, lots of people died, Jacob. Lots of people died." He had figured that she must have loved his father a lot, and that it hurt to talk about him, so he had stopped. But now, to realize that his father probably hadn't died, wasn't someone his mom had loved, and worse, was a rapist, seemed overwhelming. His footsteps slowed, his heart pounding in his chest, and he looked around for the first time. The moon was out, and its bright sliver of light added enough illumination for him to see where he was. Over the rise, the herd of cattle gave off little noise, their nightly routines barely affected by the boy so nearby. To his right, Jacob saw Mr. Banks's house. A dim light glowed from one window, and Jacob, not knowing who to turn to, approached the house to see if old Mr. Banks was still awake. The old man was like a grandfather to him. Since Chris and Carrie had come, the normal routine of having him for dinner each Sunday had fallen by the wayside, and if there was anything that could be done about the strange and disturbing situation at hand, Mr. Banks would be the person to know what to do. Jacob crossed the yard, realizing for the first time that he had run off without shoes as his feet encountered a mostly dry cow pie. When he knocked on the front door, there was no response. It wasn't that late, but Jacob wondered if the old man was all right. He hadn't been feeling well the last month, and Mr. Banks was getting up there in years. What if he had slipped and fallen and was lying on the floor of his bathroom? What if he had suffered a heart attack? These questions and concerns emboldened Jacob to try the front door. It was locked. He knocked, called out to the old man. "Mr. Banks, it's Jacob. Mr. Banks, are you all right? Can I come in?" Jacob missed Mr. Banks. He wasn't much of a talker, and he would retreat into silence when there were more than a handful of people in the room. Like most of the residents of Belton, he had seen great loss. In the outbreak of war, he had lost his wife, along with his only son and grandson. His grandson Alan had died before Jacob was born. But since Chris had returned, he had heard more details about him and his death. Jacob stopped in his tracks. Chris had said that Lieutenant Cooper had killed Alan, and just a few minutes ago he had said his name again. "That damned Lieutenant Scott Cooper destroyed your life. Jacob was born because an evil man who raped and murdered countless women put his seed into you. Looking at him is like seeing that bastard's face over and over again." He could hear those words repeating in his head. Cooper was his father, and he had murdered Mr. Banks's grandson, Alan. Perhaps, upon hearing the news, Mr. Banks wouldn't want anything to do with him. Jacob faltered, uncertain, fearful. He was about to turn away when he heard a creak on the floorboards inside. Jacob turned back toward the door in time to see it quickly open, and a man who was definitely not Mr. Banks step into the doorway. Everything moved too suddenly. Jacob was still trying to puzzle out who this man was when the man's right hand lashed out and clocked him hard on the side of the head. Jacob slumped to the ground. Scott Cooper stared at the unconscious boy at his feet and contemplated whether or not he should kill him now. The boy was dark-haired, thin but wiry, and looked to be about 12 or 13. He wouldn't pose a problem to Cooper, and he might actually come in handy. He looked out into the night, filled with dim moonlight. No one else in sight. The kid might have some information. He might know if that family out on Kentucky Road had been found yet. He probably also knew about militia watch schedules. He was old enough to participate, by the looks of him, and it was time that Cooper was moving on. Cooper reached down and grabbed the boy's arms and dragged him inside.